Welcome to Smart Energy, a podcast where we talk about electrification, home improvement, and clean energy. I'm your host, Andrew Zellner, Editor-in-Chief at OhmConnect.
And I'm your co-host, Kelsey Bourgeois, Senior Editor here at OhmConnect.
OhmConnect is on a mission to rally people to change how and when they use electricity, unlocking clean, affordable, and reliable energy. You can learn more and get paid to conserve energy at ohmconnect.com. Thanks for joining me, Kelsey.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
What's on your mind today?
So it's a TikTok, which shouldn't surprise you, but it's a Hank Green TikTok, so cream of the crop TikTok. He did a video in the last week that was answering the question, is an EV or an internal combustion car better for the environment? And answering the question on a large scale, not just, CO2 emissions immediately, right? But production of the car, the whole process line, and he gave a really good answer. But when I went to the comments, it was really interesting because a lot of people were discouraging one another from getting EVs, saying, well, your generation source at your house is probably dirty. So why would you get an EV when you're charging with dirty energy anyway? And it occurred to me, oh, I see. People don't really know what's going on with our grid. It made me really understand why there's a disconnect for people between electrification and how that impacts the climate.
And I think it's really interesting because also like there's a ton of like news about electrification. It's this buzzword, and like people, people sort of act like they don't have electricity at their house,
yes.
Or like then they also, I think it's sort of like immediately your mind goes to, I can't afford to spend $100,000 getting an EV and making all these upgrades to my house. So I'm not going to do any of it,
Yes, it's so easy to get that feeling of, I can't do all of it, so I can't do any of it. And that's a fair response when you're talking about those big ticket items. Mm-hmm. But as I think you're alluding to, there's some smaller ticket items. You can, it's not all or nothing. You don't have to spend all this money to get an EV, get a home battery system, all these things right away. But I do want to kind of talk about the grid and sort of the direction that it's going, because, people aren't wrong that depending on where they live, their generation source that fuels their home may be dirty energy, or at least partially dirty energy, right? But I think what that misses is the knowledge that you and I have in this industry that the grid is getting greener all the time. I mean, the pace of renewables, I read yesterday that from 2020 to now, the installation of solar panels was more than ever before in all of history. So like the pace is just sort of almost unfathomable if you're not thinking about it day to day, the way that our grid is turning more renewable all the time.
And I think that's a really good point, is that one of the benefits of having access to the internet is that you have access to all of the information from forever.
All the time, ever.
And we touched on this a little bit in another podcast, but there's also this idea that like facts change, things change, rules of thumb change. Yes. And like I would say, yes, in 2010, the grid was dirty and the math on carbon emissions was different for electrification.
Yes.
2010 was almost 15 years ago.
Yeah, we're bumping up against 2024 here. It's a different world.
And so like the other thing is like folks learn something and then they latch onto that as like truth forever.
Yes. And I think again, if you're not in this industry, maybe that's fair, but I think it's worth spreading that. So I was in the comment section, like, actually, so I'm cool. It's like my version of Reddit. I'm a girl Redditor. But, once you know something, you really want to share it with people. I really wanted to be like, I hear what you're saying, and it depends on where you live. But in the coming years, whatever grid you're on is going to be getting greener, And I think some people also balk at that if they are just aware of politics and not aware of the energy industry, because they might think, oh, well, not everybody cares about climate change. So why would that be true? And again, it's missing that piece of information that it's cheaper. And
Yeah.
so like that's what we're going to do because this
the
is
market
capitalism.
has shifted.
Yes,
and
yes.
installing solar panels is way cheaper. No one is building a new coal-fired power plant. Like the energy generation is getting greener and getting greener at a pace that like hasn't been seen before.
Right. And of course, there's still more to go, and there are still some sort of middle generation sources that they're sort of controversial or whatever. But as you said, the solar and the wind. I mean, I also saw a headline today about how wind turbine technician is such a smart thing to be, which I totally agree. If you are looking to go into the trades, you can make 80 grand with no college degree. You're working on wind turbines because we just need so many people to be doing this. Even if you're reading the headlines about various offshore wind farms being canceled, even that aside, there are so many jobs and we need so many people to be working in this industry. So there's really a lot of opportunity in a couple of ways. So anyway, when we think about electrification, that's the argument. That is why we're saying you should electrify your home because in the coming years, the grid will be clean.
And so one of the other like interesting things to think about is like I think ideally everyone would electrify everything in their home and make all these upgrades and like the world would be a better place.
Yeah.
In reality, most folks when they're thinking about making upgrades to their home, especially with appliances and HVAC, they're doing it when those appliances and their HVAC system is at its end of life and is going to need to be replaced. And because there are, rebates in the Inflation Reduction Act that are good for the next 10 years and beyond, you don't have to get rid of appliances that are functioning just fine in order to electrify them. And go ahead.
Well, I was going to say that's a really important point. And, depending on what sort of money that you make, you might be tempted to do that. But I think from a sustainability standpoint, that point's really good to hit of you don't need to get rid of everything you have. You can use everything you have until it is unusable. But the next thing that you buy should be this other version. And, John said something about this last week on the podcast, John Anderson, about one of the challenges and one of the things is that we are making those purchases. He called them lumpy purchases, which is an economics word that I know now, where, you're making them in a panic. You're making them at the end of the life. You're making them periodically. They're not regular purchases. And so part of what we need to do is create a system where the tradespeople involved, the home goods stores, the Home Depots, the Lowe's, whatever, have it on the shelf so that in a pinch where you can't be without hot water for 3 weeks while you wait for the hot water, heat pump hot water heater necessarily. So that stuff needs to be readily available with the trade people available and skilled and trained to install it, which is the next challenge, perhaps.
So our guest today, Nate Russell, spoiler alert, he also emphasized that when you have that opportunity to electrify an appliance, if you don't, you lock yourself into that fossil fuel system for another 10 to 15 years.
Right. Which is a lot. That's scary.
and like in 10 to 15 years, think of how green our grid is going to be.
Right. You're going to feel really silly in 10 to 15 years even probably in 5 years, you're going to be like, oh man, should have really sprung for the other one.
And the other thing that I think is important about electrification is that like your home is already electrified. You have electricity there. Yes. And like we're really only talking about 3 or 4 things in your home that you should be thinking about switching to electric when the time comes to fix or replace them. And so we're talking about the furnace. Your air conditioning is already electric. We're talking about a water heater. We're talking about a range or a cooktop, and in some cases also your dryer. And these are all, the water heater, your range and your cooktop, and your dryer have service lives of 10 to 15 years. And when you replace them, put in an electric one. And like it's like really that simple. You may be paying more for electricity right now, those prices will continue to go up, but like the cost for natural gas or other fossil fuels will also continue to go up.
And I would guess, depending on what happens politically, maybe even more. So,
yeah.
But also, if you care about the environment, this is really where you have personal impact. And I know it can be really dissuading to be involved in climate action when you feel like, well, what I do personally doesn't really matter. And actually, the appliances in your home that you use every day could be argued is maybe the biggest personal impact you have, even more than how you shop and what you eat and those things. Like, that's all good, and we're going to encourage you to do that too, but replacing something you use every single day with a cleaner version, it's either cleaner now or going to be cleaner, just makes sense.
I have also been thinking a lot about sort of like energy independence. I read an article this morning about a farmer in Australia who is well known for being off the grid. Lives 5 hours outside the nearest like metropolitan area, and his farm runs solely on solar power. And he drives an EV around his property. That like an EV is his farm truck.
Yeah, cool.
And like, I also grew up in farming country in Wisconsin, and I didn't grow up on a farm. My friends' families had farms, and like one of the things you don't realize is if you have a farm, you also have a tank with 500 or 1,000 gallons of fuel on your property to refuel all of your tractors and vehicles, but you're paying for that fuel in bulk. Like, you have this tank on your property that is like sort of an eco hazard,
Yes.
at some point. And just the idea that if you have solar panels, if you're fully electric, the sun, which continues to shine each day, will give you all of the power you need to like go about your life, and you don't have to rely on anybody else for that.
Yeah, and I know that off-grid lifestyle is really interesting to a lot of people. The good news, what I will say is a couple episodes ago, we interviewed Kelly Larson, who's a farmer, and she works that nonprofit that gives money to young and diverse farmers. She talked about this too. She was like, you don't realize it, but actually you need a lot of power on a farm to run a farm. There's quite, we sort of, if you're not connected with farming at all, you're like, oh, they're just like growing things. It's really natural. It's like, well, there's a lot else that goes beyond just growing something. What I can tell you is there's money through, I think, the USDA and a couple other departments. There is money for farms to make their processes greener right now, which is great to see that investment just across the board, right?
And it's also interesting, like there are certain crops that like grow well with some shade cover, and you see farmers like having a field full of solar panels and then like planting their crops under the solar panels because those crops benefit from that shade. Like there are a lot of interesting interconnected ways that like folks can monetize or like take advantage of green energy and like in an ancillary fashion.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a little different, but it makes me think of like rain collection water barrels where it's like that it's going to rain on your roof anyway. Wouldn't it be cool to like use that water for something? Like, there's a lot of people in my neighborhood with those that they use to water their gardens. And yeah, I love that mixed use. And I think that just shows in general, I mean, we're seeing it in cities too, right? A lot of spaces are dual purpose, and you love to see it. You love to see one space being used for multiple reasons, and one of them being, clean energy.
Well, our guest today is Nate Russell. He is a person who's built his own fully electric home. He lives in Michigan and works for an energy efficiency building consulting firm. It was a very, very interesting conversation, but we go through a bunch of myths around electrification and debunk them a little bit. So you're definitely going to want to listen in.
Cool. Ready to hear it.
Our guest today is Nate Russell, Senior Energy Engineer at Beyond Efficiency. Nate, thanks for joining me.
Oh, thank you for having me.
So can you tell me a little bit about what Beyond Efficiency does?
Sure. We're a high performance building consulting group. We're based in Jackson, Wyoming, and we have staff in just kind of spread out through the Pacific Northwest and the Western region. And I'm actually remote, located in Northern Michigan. And yeah, so we do high performance building consulting. So we focus on both single family homes as well as multifamily. And we're kind of split up into two groups with, with the single family oriented folks and then the multifamily group. And the multifamily group, they really focus on affordable housing, specifically in the San Francisco Bay Area.
And then what does a senior energy engineer do?
So I guess I do energy modeling as well as building envelope performance consulting and just overall whole systems strategies and guidance and whatnot. So we typically like to start with the envelope, get that as good as we can, and then we turn to the mechanical systems and try to meet those loads as efficiently as possible. So we'll run those energy models and see what makes sense, and then we'll tailor the mechanical systems around those results.
And so, I think with like larger buildings, multifamily housing, that like energy modeling is a more common thing than not. On the single family side, it feels like that's still a little bit of an anomaly.
Yeah,
Um,
no, yeah, that's definitely true. It's certainly not as common, but on the at least we do enough projects in California, a lot of projects in California, so those require us to do some energy compliance modeling, and that can help
okay.
us drive envelope decisions and mechanical decisions as well. But for other projects outside of California, we'll also run independent energy models just to see, yeah, how the building's going to do and what we can do better.
Can you talk a little bit about what an energy model like really is?
Yeah, so we're basically inputting all the characteristics of the building. So that would be the envelope, the windows, so right, your walls, your roof, your foundation, windows, air tightness, and then um, we can use that to develop kind of our heating and cooling loads to help inform mechanical decisions. And then we can go a step farther and look at that mechanical equipment and see and estimate how much energy that's going to use just based on the performance and design of that system. And we can get pretty far into the weeds with the details. So like we can specify, for example, like if you put the ducts outside of the building envelope, how much is that going to impact energy use versus keeping your ductwork within the building envelope?
Do you do any work on existing buildings?
Yes, but the majority of our work is focused on new builds, but here and there we do have kind of additions or major remodels or gut rehab type projects that come in. But again, it's really, yeah, heavy. The majority of our work is on the new construction.
Um, I always love asking this question. How did you get into this field, energy modeling, energy efficiency?
Sure. So I guess I've always kind of been involved in construction in some way or another since I was a little kid, and always seemed there's some sort of project happening on the side, and yeah, just participating in that. And then as I became, I guess, more knowledgeable or more educated, like after going to school, I took a few courses in kind of green building or a few, yeah, like in green building or high performance building, um, like engineering type courses. And I don't know, that just inspired me to see basically how can we do better? How can we, yeah, yeah, just how can we do better? How can we make things better? And yeah, so the energy modeling is really a way to kind of quantify that and um, yeah, do things better.
What like did you know about this job or this career like in high school? Like,
No, I certainly did not know about that. Yeah, I really didn't know about it. It wasn't until I went to college that I really learned and became more informed on yeah, better building practices and high performance buildings, and then all the kind of all the information on how like building energy use is a major component of global warming and kind of all that
Mm-hmm.
good stuff. So yeah, it's just as I became more informed about it, it was just, yeah, the motivation to do better, I guess.
So you mentioned you're in Michigan, and I understand you also built a fully electric home.
Yep. Yeah, yeah. So that was about 4 years ago or 5 years ago. Yeah, I designed and built a high performance home, and with the help of my family, did most of the work. I did kind of contract out excavation, well, septic systems, and the foundation, but everything else was done between me and my family. And yeah, it was quite a project, and very informative, and kind of provide some great hands-on experience and kind of true, um, or yeah, just that um, real world experience with what a high performance all electric building looks like.
Can you talk me through some of the highlights or lowlights of building it?
Sure. I mean, the design that was probably one of my favorite parts, was just tweaking. I guess tweaking floor plans was a big, yeah, was a lot of fun for me. And then also just um, coming up with the various strategies for how to air seal and how to get higher performing walls and roof. Well, I guess it's a ceiling in this case, and the foundation as well. So yeah, and yeah, just researching the various strategies and whatnot. Yeah,
Um, so you mentioned things like wall assemblies, ceiling assemblies, foundations. For someone who like doesn't know what a wall assembly is, like what are the pieces you're talking about there?
sure. So like a wall assembly, if we take that as that's a good example. It's typically you're looking at wood framing. You got a bottom plate. You got studs. They're usually either on 16 or 24-inch centers. You got your top plates, and then whatever's going on with the ceiling or how the roof comes into play. But if we just focus on the walls, we're looking at what's the best way to both insulate it and also promote kind of durability and resilience, and make sure. And I guess that's the high performance aspect. And it really boils down to, I guess, moisture control and thermal control and whatnot. So it's kind of where you put your insulation and how you insulate. So on this house specifically, I went with exterior rigid foam. So there's some insulation in the cavity, but then there's foam on the outside of the sheathing that does quite a bit of work on the kind of the durability and resilience side. So I guess the gist of it is it just keeps the sheathing warmer, which ultimately keeps it drier. Whereas typical construction, you usually think of like fiberglass bats going
Mm-hmm.
into the wall. So that what that does is that actually insulates the sheathing, so that keeps the sheathing colder, and that's where kind of you run into it's considered a higher risk design, particularly in the cold climates, because that sheathing stays colder, which means it doesn't dry out as easily.
And then, so I think in most homes, people are familiar with they know about electricity, but the like real electrification that we're talking about is really in the HVAC system and water heating, and and also cooking potentially.
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah, yeah. Typically, if you have gas systems, you're exactly right. It's your range, it's your hot water heater, and it's your heating system. And with electrification, there it just provides kind of better and substantially more efficient ways to do all of that. And I guess starting with the range, that that's just yeah, with the range, it's looking at the induction type systems, as opposed to what commonly comes to mind is just your electric resistance with the red
With the
coils
coils,
heating
yeah.
up and staying hot forever, and yeah, and taking forever to cool down as well. But with induction, it's a magnetically driven system, so it actually uses a magnetic field to heat the pan, and it's not relying on a very high temperature, that high temperature element to transfer heat. Instead, it's the magnetism inducing resistance within the pan, which warms it up. So it keeps things much cooler. It's much more efficient because basically all that energy is going right into the pan as opposed to going around the pan and just out into the house or out your vent hood if you have one. And then if we look at hot water heating, again, electric, you might be thinking your typical electric resistant system where you have one or two elements within say a 50-gallon storage tank, and those just cycle on and off. But with higher performing options, you can use a heat pump water heater, which has a small little, in most cases, it's a unitary system where you have a small heat pump sitting on top of the tank, and it's actually pulling heat from the surrounding air and warming up the water. And with that, you can get about 300% efficient, maybe a little higher, compared to your electric resistance system, which for all intents and purposes, we can just say is 100% efficient. So it's about 3 times more efficient. And then likewise with your heating system, again, you're probably thinking electric baseboard would be the most common type where you just have the baseboards, they have the electric resistance element and they come on and off. But again, you can use those heat pumps again, just like for the hot water, but you can use it for heating and cooling your house as well. And similarly, it depends on your climate, but you're looking at anywhere from 200 to about 450% efficiency. And then I guess also just to be really clear, like that efficiency number is based on the electricity or the energy we're paying for, which is the electricity. So it's not breaking the laws of thermodynamics or anything about that, anything like that. It's just, it's based on the electricity input. So it's in a sense, or not in a sense, it is robbing energy from the air and transferring that to your heat pump coil. And then that allows the heating or cooling of your house.
I think that's a good clarification. We're, using heat that we don't pay for in the air to turn into heat that like we feel in our homes. So, you've been in your house for 4 or 5 years. You're in the industry. You're always thinking about energy. Would you do anything differently if you were building it today?
Yeah. So, my wife and I, we've talked about that, and we would do things differently. And I guess one of the things we do differently is for kind of the sleeping wing of the house. It's 3 bedrooms and 2 baths, and that's kind of now its own hall. We ended up just putting a ductless wall-hung unit in the hallway, and we just relied on leaving our bedroom doors open to heat and cool the rooms. And on the heating side, it works out pretty well. As long as we keep the doors open, it's a pretty consistent temperature over there. If we close the doors, the temperature reduces a little bit, but it's kind of like a nighttime setback in a sense. And for us, it's okay for sleeping. On the cooling side, though, the cooling doesn't distribute as well. So even with the doors open, we do have ceiling fans in the bedrooms too, and that helps circulate air a little bit, but it could be better. So if we were to do it again, we would probably put a small ducted system for the kind of those closed off sleeping rooms, and run ducts to each room so you get a direct distribution of the air instead of that kind of indirect distribution relying on the open doors. Another thing was we went with a detached garage, and part of that was I guess the concerns over air quality issues from like car exhaust and chemicals and whatnot getting pulled into the building from that attached garage, and then also some I would say, looking back now, over concern about thermal bridging and whatnot from the structural components and whatnot. But as long as you plan ahead, they really become, I think, minimal manageable issues. So we have a whole house ventilation system that's always circulating fresh air into the building and exhausting that stale air. So I feel confident that's going to handle any of the pollutants or emissions or whatever that find their way into the house for that short period where the door's opening and closing. And then on the structural on the thermal bridging side, I mean, it's more or less just treat that garage demising wall as an exterior wall and detail it as you would any other thing. And you might not be able to completely eliminate the thermal bridges, but you can do a pretty good job, and it'll be good.
Also, I know living in Minneapolis, we also have a detached garage, but during the winter, having to go out, walk through the snow, get into your car, well, there are, like, humans have to live in buildings too. It's like not just about energy.
Sure.
And I'm curious a little bit, what is sort of your approach to balancing efficiency and aesthetics?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I want to. Coming from an engineering background, I guess I kind of value the efficiency a little more, but I think you can have both. I don't think there's a challenge necessarily there, and that's just I mean, it's just to me, I guess it really just boils down to simplifying designs, simplifying your footprints to some extent, and maybe cutting back on those like kind of bump outs, jogs, and dormers and whatnot. It just makes kind of the efficiency aspects more attainable and higher success rate with achieving them. So I guess the short answer is you can have both. You just have to, as long as you plan for it and consider it early on, I think you can easily adapt kind of those high performance building assemblies to really any design. But it's just the simpler that design is, the easier it is and higher success rate.
So we both know electrification works. It hasn't been the norm, especially in sort of like heating first climates like the upper Midwest is. I saw your 8 myths about electrification in Fine Home Building this month, the December, January issue. And I thought there was a very good, succinct way of sort of like addressing concerns folks have about electrification. Would you be able to walk me through some of your myths?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, we can certainly go through each one and provide a little more details. So the first one is that electrification is expensive. And I think part of that is we can look at the first cost of some electric equipment, like your heat pump, like your mini split system, that's a heat pump system. So like your mini splits, probably going to be higher cost upfront than, say, a forced air system with AC condenser outside. But when you look at your operational costs, it depends. The operational cost can be substantially lower just because that mini split system is anywhere from that 200 to 450% efficient, depending on your climate. Whereas the gas system, you're stuck at 100%. Well, it's a little less than 100%, but in upper 90s. So on your operational side, particularly if you're looking at a fuel, oil, or propane system, there's a good chance your mini split system is going to be less. It's going to cost less to operate. Then with natural gas, though, it really depends on your local rates. It's tough to make blanket statements with that one because just rates are so variable. Like me here, 12 cents a kilowatt hour. A colleague in California, he just shared his peak rates are like 51 cents a kilowatt hour. And then I have a colleague in Wyoming, I believe she said it's either 4 or 6 cents a kilowatt hour. So it's just, you really have to look at your local rates to see how they'll compare. And then I think another thing that comes into play with electrification is when people hear electric systems, they immediately go to those electric baseboards, electric resistance, and their minds. I don't think they quite jump to heat pumps yet. So again, it's just going to the heat pumps, and it's a much more efficient technology. So it drops it reduces your electricity cost for heating by whatever that difference is, say 50 to it reduces it to 25 or 50% of the cost.
I think it's also, one of the things, most humans think in terms of like hard costs of like, this is how much I'm going to pay for these things. This is how much I'm going to pay every month. But like there are costs that aren't accounted for in natural gas, in some of these other fuel oils, also in kind of electricity generation. Although I feel like electricity companies, utility providers, do a pretty good job of passing along all of those costs to their end consumers. But you mentioned earlier, global warming and climate change, and like the true cost of natural gas isn't accounted for in the bill you pay.
Right. Yeah. Those externalized costs. Yes.
Yeah.
There's, yeah, definitely not captured. And then the other thing I forgot to mention with the with electric systems is if you go all electric, you also avoid having to install all the gas infrastructure in your house.
Mm-hmm.
So that can be pretty significant savings, just avoiding the gas piping in the house. And again, I imagine it depends on utilities, but sometimes you might have to pay to get the gas up to your house in the first place, but other times, certainly seen where utilities cover that cost up to the meter, and then you're responsible for everything kind of beyond the meter. Sorry, one more thing. And then there's the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, that has substantial incentives to do electrification. So Rewire America has a great summary of all the electrification incentives, and for heat pumps, I think it's 4,000. There's an incentive of $4,000 if you're over, I believe it's the 80% median income, and if you're below the 80% median income, it's $8,000 incentive for installing a heat pump. So that really, I imagine that's really gonna negate the upfront cost concerns. It's gonna make it competitive for sure, or even better, because if we take the simplest system, which is a mini split, a single zone kind of forced air mini split system, it's more or less all the same skills and very similar equipment to doing a gas forced air system with an AC condenser outside. So on the insulation side of things, it's pretty similar.
And so kind of the second myth you talked about is there's this myth that the grid is dirty, and so we should minimize the amount we're using the grid.
Right. And yeah, so it's just, am I basically robbing Peter to pay Paul? I'm just pushing my emissions over there. So what's the point, right? But I guess the Rocky Mountain Institute, they did an in-depth study on this, looking at, okay, what happens if we convert our hot water and space heating to heat pumps? Are we actually going to realize an emissions penalty or not? And the short answer is no. It's actually within the first year, I think the lowest state, which was one of the Midwest ones, I don't remember which one, but it was about a 10% reduction in emissions in the first year. And then over the lifetime of the equipment, it was, I think, about 35% emissions reduction. And then if you go to states that have that have more renewable energy in their grids, like California and Pacific Northwest, their reductions were substantial. I think like 93% reduction in emissions over that 15-year lifespan. So I think that shows that the emissions, that it is an emissions benefit, and we are not just shifting our emissions elsewhere.
Well, and also the market is really driving the adoption of renewables at the utility scale. Like it's become so much less expensive to do solar and wind that like even though a utility company is driven by profit, and they're going to do the things that make them the most profit, and more and more that is adding more renewables to the grid.
Right. Yes. Yeah, exactly.
Your third myth that you mentioned is one that always gets me, and the fact, and we call gas heating, we call it natural gas. It comes from the earth. The myth that gas is clean, and it's not.
Right. No, I mean, if you zoom in really closely and you look at, say, a gas combustion system versus a solid fuel system like wood or coal or something like that, then sure, it
Mhm.
looks really good. But when you zoom out and look at kind of the whole life cycle, emissions and impact, it doesn't look so good anymore. It just starts with that harvesting. There are substantial leaks, there's flaring, and whether that's actually burned or just vented, it's tough to say. Then transport, and that's either through your pipelines or even in your house. There's studies coming out that showing that there are kind of minor leaks within a lot of people's homes as well. Then when you use the appliance, there's often a little bit of gas leakage as well. And then at end of life, for like when wells are sealed up, it's kind of, it seems like it often goes in kind of a no man's land, and those wells are just left, and they are sources of additional leaks. And then getting that resolved becomes much more complicated because the companies may no longer exist, or it's up to the state or whoever it may be. It's a complicated picture. And then combusting it as well. I mean, just by default, combustion produces carbon dioxide, so that's a pollutant.
Mhm.
Natural gas itself is a decent has decent global warming potential as well. But then you also get indoor air quality issues, like with gas ranges, with that kind of controversy. Was it 6 months ago or a year ago, whatever it was? So I mean, those studies are showing that gas combustion, like specifically from ranges, is detrimentally impacting your indoor air quality, and it seems to be a cause of as increased asthma rates. So if you have a gas stove, the best thing you can do is make sure you're operating your range hood, and that range hood is venting to the exterior. And otherwise, yeah, the induction range is a great alternative.
So the fourth myth you mentioned here, um, that gas heat works when the grid goes down, or when you talk about electrification, people always think about like, well, what happens during a blackout? And that's another myth, because you still need electricity.
Right. Yeah. So your most central gas systems, whether it's a boiler or a furnace, and even like a fuel oil or propane, whatever it may be, they have electronic components in them. So they might have combustion fans, they have exhaust fans, they have circulators, all sorts of controls, safety systems, and igniters. So when the grid goes down, you don't have the electricity to power those systems. So those systems are going to shut down as well. And there's really no significant benefit there. I will admit the one small benefit is you're going to have a lower backup power requirement to power a gas system, because that fuel, that the gas or whatever it may be, is providing the heat. So the electricity requirement is much lower for those gas systems. But either way, you need a backup system, and yeah, it's not a decisive win or anything for the gas system.
Um, your fifth myth here, that you need a 200 amp service at minimum in order to electrify, I think is one a lot of people are thinking about, because that sort of like panel upgrade or service upgrade feels like a hurdle for kind of electrifying your entire home.
Sure. Yeah, so I guess it really depends on your home, and there's in a lot of cases you can get away with 100 amp service. You might have to do some modifications, and there are smart breakers or load sharing breakers that will switch that will prevent two high draw appliances from operating. So, for example, you might have your electric dryer and your electric range connected together in this smart breaker. So you'll prioritize one of them, so they both can't operate at the same time, but they can operate independently. Otherwise, you can another strategy is trying to reduce your heating and cooling loads by more or less weatherizing your house to the extent possible, so you can install smaller heat pumps, and that can reduce your panel requirements. And for me specifically, I have a sense monitor on my home, and I looked at my highest amperage draw over the past year, and it was 75 amps. And I have I have two 1-to-1 mini splits. I have the electric range, the heat pump water heater, the standard electric dryer, and then like small kitchen appliances tend to have high short-term draws. But yeah, so I maxed out at 75 amps, and it lasted, I think, a minute or so. But and looking at the electric code, I would be able to add, I believe it was another 5 amps, and still be all right with that 100 amp panel. So for new construction, I mean, it's easier to go with a 200 amp right off the bat, but you could get away with a smaller service. And for existing buildings, there are some pathways to help reduce that load or that burden on the panel and get your amperage low enough so the 100 amp panel will work. And Redwood Energy, they have something called the Watt Diet, which is a guide that will help you through reducing your loads and strategizing for electrification. And then also, if worst comes to worst, the IRA, they're providing incentives for panel upgrades and wiring.
Yeah, good shout out to Redwood Energy. Sean was actually a guest on an earlier podcast, so definitely go check that one out.
Yeah, his guide is very good.
Yeah, super fascinating guy. The sixth myth you mentioned here is one I think a lot about. Being in Minnesota, it's cold, and folks think that heat pumps don't work in cold climates. Right,
and I think that's rooted in kind of the older technology where if it dropped below, it was roughly 40 degrees, the system shut off. So you need a backup system. But the new technology, the cold climate, relatively new technology, it's been around 10, 15 years at least. But that technology, the mini splits, the cold climate mini split systems, they're capable of operating down to negative 15 degrees outside and maintaining 80% of their capacity. So what that means is, if you're in climate zone, say 5 or lower, which is very roughly, like if you're south of Wisconsin, excluding the Rockies, you're in pretty good shape. Your mini split is going to cover 100% of your needs. If you go north of Illinois, that Wisconsin-Illinois border, if you go north of that, you're going to start getting into climate zone 6. And there, it really depends. You have to look at what your lows are and which is part of the heating system design. But in a lot of cases, you will still be fine with a mini split system. And for example, like I'm up in northwest lower Michigan, and we just have mini splits. We don't have any backup, and we haven't had a problem. But we dip into the negatives on occasion, like very infrequently. But we do hang out in the single digits and low double digits, and again, no problems whatsoever. And then when you get into those colder areas of zone 6, or where they have much lower lows, or when you get into climate zone 7, which is like the top half of North Dakota, northern Minnesota, top of Maine, in those areas, and part of the Rockies, in those areas, you probably are going to need some sort of backup. And sometimes code requires some, in like Wyoming, for example, they require, at least in certain parts, they require designing down to negative 30. So you have to put in some sort of backup system, and that can be just electric baseboard, or some mini split systems will allow you to. They have options to incorporate electric resistance heat strips right into the system, and those are designed to only come on when they're needed. So the vast majority of the time, you're going to be operating within the limits of the mini split system. So you're still getting all those benefits, but on those kind of brief periods or short periods where the temperature drops too low, you are going to have to rely on that electric resistance or some other backup.
I think that's an important point to kind of think about is, historically we've installed HVAC systems that cover 100% of heating all the time. And in the heat pump world, you're really specifying a system that can cover almost all the time. And there's just those 1 or 2% of times where you have to do a little bit more.
Right. And then also for the majority of the country too, we're if we zoom way out and we look at the country, we're going to see like most of our population centers, we're going to be falling in to those areas where the mini split system can handle 100% of the heating loads. But again, that's not to dismiss those cold climate and those very cold climate areas, because it's certainly important to have heat when it's cold. But like you said, you are that short period, that 1-2% of the time during the year, you might have to turn on that supplemental heating.
So your seventh myth here is, we've kind of touched on it already, but the idea that electric cooking is dangerous too, just like cooking with gases.
Right. Yeah. And just to reiterate, it's much lower temperatures that you're cooking with. I mean, the stovetop gets basically as hot as the pan gets, and it's much cooler than either having a flame or that red electric resistance element. And then some other benefits with induction system is it rapidly responds to changes. So when we're cooking, we turn it down, it turns down. You're not waiting however long for the element to cool off. It's a virtually instant response. And another benefit is with the cooler temperatures, when the food splatters out of the pan, it's not getting baked onto the stovetop. So it keeps it much, much cleaner. And then we have 2 young kids that like to help cook with us. So it's a safer area as well. And not saying they can touch the pots, but it's definitely less hazardous than a flame or that resistance element.
And then the last myth here is that heat pump water heaters are complicated.
Sure. And they aren't, but there is a little planning and just planning that has to go into them and locating them. One of the most common complaints is that they're loud, and that can be the case. And what we can do to remedy that is either if you have the space, you can locate it away from your living area. So, for example, if you have a storage room in your basement or something like that, or an unfinished area of your basement, you can tuck it away there. In milder climates, you can put it outside in an exterior closet or in your garage. If you can't locate it away from those kind of more sensitive areas, you can look at some sound mitigation strategies for the room it's in, and you can also schedule. Oftentimes they have controls that you can schedule when they operate. So if it's possible, you can set it. If you're away at work during the day, you can have it charge up the tank while you're away, or if the sound doesn't bother you while you're sleeping, then you can have it run while you're sleeping. And additionally, some other things that help there too is higher storage temperatures. So you can just do 1 charge a day or a larger tank volume. So maybe instead of going with a 50-gallon tank, you go with a 65 or an 80-gallon tank. So you just charge that up in the middle of the night or when you're at work, and then you're good until the next day.
So I also, having worked in the magazine business, know that sometimes you're constrained by the length of an article. Are there any other myths that come to mind?
Nothing immediately, but I guess I think the complicate. I mean, we covered the complication, I think, but that's it's not complicated. I think it does require some planning and a little bit of forethought, but I think it's completely manageable and doable. But besides that, I don't think there's nothing immediately comes to mind.
One thing I want to make sure we call out is, the idea that you don't necessarily have to electrify your entire home at once if you're, living in an existing home like most Americans do, but that when the opportunity to replace a gas appliance with an electric one comes across, like that's the time to do it. Otherwise, you're locking yourself into another decade or more of relying on natural gas.
Right. Yeah. So in existing buildings, one very practical approach is to do it as equipment reaches end of life. But one critical thing with that is planning for that replacement, because if it becomes an emergency and your gas hot water heater has failed, you're probably not going to want to wait to get all the electric infrastructure in place. You're going to want a new heater in yesterday, basically. So that's one critical aspect is planning for it. So if you know your water heater is 10, 15 years old, that's the time to be kind of proactive about it and replace it and do that planned replacement so it's not an emergency. And then, like you said, when we don't do that, we're basically barring something crazy, that appliance is probably going to sit there until its end of life again, which is in the ballpark of 10 to 15 years. So you're committing that appliance or that building to gas use for another 10 to 15 years. And kind of along those lines, in new builds, it's so easy to do this right off the bat, because you can immediately plan for everything you need and just do it right away. And then similarly, if you don't, you got another 10 to 15 years. And I don't want to get, I guess I worry a little bit. I don't want people to worry that like there's this massive infrastructure or rewiring or something that you have to do for a replacement. There's certainly some rewiring that has to be done, but it's not, I wouldn't call it a huge undertaking. It's like for your heat pump water heater, you're going to have to install a 30 amp breaker in your breaker box and then route like a 10 gauge wire to your hot water heater. If you already have an electric resistance system, you're set. It's designed around that. And then there are, with heat pump water heaters, there are 120 volt plug-in versions that have just arrived on the market as well. And that can also help with, that kind of touches upon your service entrance panel with the 100 amp service. That 120 amp system can help reduce the draw.
Great. Well, Nate, I want to thank you so much for taking some time to chat through your journey in electrification. Folks want to learn more about your business and your work. Where should they go?
We're at beyondefficiency.us. And then
Awesome.
I guess another thing that I do want to mention, as part of the work we do, we are working on an ADU guide, and that's right now we're focusing on the Bay Area, and it's a technical how-to guide that really gets into concise information on how to build an efficient, high-performing ADU. And again, we're starting in the Bay Area, but we're looking to gradually expand to the entire U.S. eventually. But you got to start small. And then that's also going to serve as a foundation for our Building Genius platform, which is going to be a platform where we'll have a forum where building professionals can get together and discuss various topics that come up, and then take deeper dives into the information that's provided into the ADU guide. So we're looking to have that ADU e-guide out in the first quarter of next year.
Awesome. I'm looking forward to it. Great. So that was Nate Russell with Beyond Efficiency. He's a senior energy engineer. And thanks again for chatting.
And thank you for having me.
Each week, we take some time to answer questions from listeners. This week, we hear from Ben, who asks, I'm trying to get more folks into understanding and saving energy. I'm going to be talking to a lot of relatives around the holiday season. Where should I start?
Oh, it's such a good question. So I mean, depending on what that person cares about, I'd approach it one of two ways. So if it's someone who cares about the environment, I'd start there. Again, there's this strange disconnect we have between the energy that we use in our homes and the impact that has on the environment. We talked about it a little bit at the top of the show too. But I'd start there about how right now generation sources are edging into more renewable and clean, but we're still primarily running on fossil fuels. And so talking about how limiting your use and saving energy at home has a real environmental benefit. Additionally, you could talk to somebody about time of use depending on where they live. You could talk to them about when they use electricity matters, right? Because depending on your grid, right? California is the easy example. During the day, it's a lot of solar power. During the night, it's a lot of wind. And in the early evening, that's when we'll get a lot of events for OhmConnect, of course. That's when we're most tempted and likely to turn on those dirty peak plants. So I'd start with the environment for those people. The advice I would give for people who maybe that's not as much of a primary motivator would be money. I mean, and hopefully that's probably a good motivator for all of us, even whether or not we care about the environment. But saving energy can save you a lot of money, again, especially if you're on those time of use plans. So that's probably how I'd approach it. Is I would think about what does this person care about, and talk to them about how saving energy can reach towards their goal, right? You want to offer them a solution to a problem that they have rather than just trying to convince someone to care about something they don't care about. What are your thoughts, Andrew?
So I think those are both really, really good. I also, I love talking about electric vehicles. And I know, in my socioeconomic demographic, there are a lot of folks who have older cars that, break down. They're in the shop, during the winter, it's cold. They don't want to start.
You and me with all our poor artist friends. We're like, yeah.
and for a lot of my friends, like their car is sort of their largest asset. They're, renting homes and so like talking them through not only like the idea that an EV is a simpler system than an internal combustion engine, which, like there are arguments in both directions, but an electric vehicle's motor is like much simpler than an internal combustion engine. Talking to them about that, but then also like talking through these rebates and like the money you can get back. Cars are super expensive, even if they're not electrified.
Yes.
And the idea that you could, in Minnesota, you could get up to $10,000 or even more back from the purchase of an EV is like that's a big money number.
A lot of money, yeah.
And EVs also aren't always super expensive. You hear about the Tesla Cybertruck, which is crazy. you hear about these vehicle manufacturers want to hype up their like crazy awesome cars,
right? That gets media attention.
It gets media attention.
Yeah.
But you can still buy a Chevy Bolt or a Volt new, and with these rebates, you're going to be spending like under $25,000, which
same.
Yeah, like for a new car, like that's like way at the bottom, regardless of what the power source is.
Right. I think that's a really good point. And I will say it's getting even easier in some ways because this year that dealership piece is coming into play where dealerships are going to be able to apply to give you that credit at point of sale, right? Because for lots of people, like you said, again, in my demographic as well, waiting till the end of the year to get that 10 grand back might frankly make it impossible. And that's true for many, many, many people. And so it's really cool to see more initiatives where it's going to be a little easier to get that point of sale rebate in some way. So I would look for that. If you're thinking of buying a car in 2024, try to find a dealership that can give you that discount up front is how it will function for you. Right. Anyway, so yes, I think those are some of the talking points that Andrew and I would use on electrification and saving energy. But I think another sort of value proposition that you might say is just not being wasteful. I think a lot of us are very uncomfortable with the sort of rampant consumerism and our ability to just kind of blow through resources with very little thought. I think that bothers a lot of us. And if you kind of connect that to energy use as well, there's perhaps some motivation there, regardless of money, regardless of the environment, of I just don't want to waste. That's silly. It feels against my values. It's not who I am. So that would be maybe the third way I would approach it.
Great. Well, Ben, I hope that answers some of your question. We're all going to be having these conversations at our upcoming get-togethers. And so I think it's important to think a little bit about how you share your newfound knowledge with other people, because that's also how these things are going to change. Yes, the government is going to regulate some of this into existence, but a lot of this stuff happens on a personal level.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the last piece of advice I'll leave with Ben is, when you're trying to convince someone, my recommendation is to ask more questions than try to force your feelings on someone. That goes better. Ask questions, ask what they care about, get them talking about what's important to them. That's usually going to go better than aggressively telling someone what to do.
Well,
good luck.
That's it for this episode of Smart Energy. Special thanks to Nate for taking some time to chat, and Ben for sending in a great question. To see the show notes, send feedback, and learn more about Smart Energy, visit ohmconnect.com/smartenergy. Stay safe, conserve some energy, and we'll see you next time.